Hi everyone, today we're going to be talking about some different sentence types. There will almost always be at least one question per passage on the AP exam about different sentence types, and even if some of them are familiar, the AP exam pacing is pretty quick, so you need to be familiar enough to be able to recognize the right answer right away. We're going to go over a few different types today. First we'll talk about what dependent clauses are just to make some of the other definitions make more sense. Then we'll take a look at run-on sentences, loose sentences, periodic sentences, compound, complex, and compound-complex sentences, hypotactic, paratactic, and telegraphic sentences, all with some examples and definitions. So to start off, to make some of the other definitions make more sense, we need to know what a dependent clause is. As the name dependent would suggest, it means that although it has a subject or a verb, it cannot stand on its own. It doesn't have its complete thought, even though it has a subject or a verb. It has to be with an independent clause. So for example, if I say when I was in college, that would be a dependent clause because it has the subject, which is I, and it has the verb, which is was, but it still doesn't make sense on its own. It sounds like it's just the beginning of a sentence, which would make it a dependent clause. With that in mind, a run-on sentence is where there is more than one independent clause. So independent, then of course by the opposite would mean that it can stand on its own. So in a run-on sentence, you have more than one independent clause joined without punctuation or conjunction. This is why run-on sentences are typically seen as not grammatically correct, with very, very few examples. An example would be, I love humanity so much I always want to read. It's color-coded here for you to see the different independent clauses, but the issue with run-on sentences is that there's nothing in the middle to clearly differentiate where one idea begins and the other ends. To fix run-on sentences, there's a few ways we could approach that. You could split it into two sentences like this example, so instead it would say, I love humanity so much, I always want to read. Or you could add a semicolon between the clauses, so it says I love humanity so much, I always want to read. Or you could add some sort of conjunction that connects the two, so I love humanity so much that I always want to read. All of those are acceptable. No one is really better than the other, it just kind of depends on the flow of your writing. For the next couple sentences, we're going to combine loose and periodic because they're opposites of each other more or less. A loose sentence is where the main clause comes first, followed by dependent clauses. So in a loose sentence, we've got the main idea right away, and then a lot of dependent clauses trailing off the end of that. This typically adds suspense, where we kind of know what's happening in the beginning, but we continue to get more detail as we read. And a loose sentence is sometimes also called a cumulative sentence. So if you see either loose or cumulative on the AP exam, it'll come back to the same definition. An example of this would be if we said the man who was sent to the office would linger about the place long enough to get the drift of the conversation from the group of white people who naturally congregated there after receiving their mail to discuss the latest news. That is from Booker T. Washington's Up From Slavery. This is an example of a loose sentence because we already see the main clause here at the beginning talking about what the man does, and then we have further description later on of what else is going on at that time. On the other hand, a periodic sentence is where the main idea or thought comes at the end of the sentence. Sometimes it's helpful for people to think of this as the main idea is closer to the period because it's the end of the sentence, and so that's why we call it a periodic sentence. An example of a periodic sentence would be saying, in order to defend and protect the women and children who were left on the plantations when the white males went to war, the slaves would have laid down their lives. So from the same source as our loose sentence example, in this periodic sentence, the fact that the slaves would lay down their lives, that's our main idea. The beginning is just kind of setting the stage for why and when they would do this. Next, we've got compound and complex sentences. These are the ones that we might already have studied or been familiar with before, but like I mentioned earlier, you've got to know it quick enough to respond very fast on the AP exam. So a compound sentence has two independent clauses joined by a conjunction, for and or, but, nor, so, and yet. So for example, I hadn't seen the season finale yet, so I avoided talking to my friends about it. Both the part in pink and the part in blue are independent clauses because each of those could stand on their own independently, but since it's a compound sentence, we're combining them with our conjunction so. Complex sentence has an independent clause with one or more dependent clauses. So whereas compound has two independent, complex has one independent plus one or more dependent. So for example, because I hadn't watched yet, I avoided talking to my friends about the season finale. Here we've got a dependent clause. With the word because at the beginning, this would not make sense to stand on its own, so it becomes a dependent clause, whereas the part in blue could make sense to stand on its own, making that an independent clause. And then if we combine the two together, we have what is called a compound complex sentence, which is where we have two independent clauses and at least one dependent clause. So we would kind of mix and match. So a possible example would be, because I hadn't watched yet, I avoided talking to my friends about the season finale and instead ate lunch on my own. So we start off with the dependent clause. Like we mentioned on the last slide, the word because makes it so that this can't stand on its own. And then we've got two independent clauses, the one in blue and the one in purple. I know that just the words in purple themselves don't stand on their own, but this word I is implied as a connection, so it still technically counts as an independent clause. The next two will also combine because they are related. Hypotactic sentence uses connecting words between clauses or sentences to show logic or the relationship between ideas. So an example would be saying, I am tired because I went to sleep late. A hypotactic sentence is not mutually exclusive from some of these other definitions. You could possibly have a compound sentence that's also hypotactic, but we just need to be familiar with the different definitions. So here, the key difference between this and the next one we'll talk about is this word because. A paratactic sentence just juxtaposes them or puts them together. So whereas the hypotactic has the different ideas and then connects them to show cause and effect or what sort of relationship there is, paratactic just puts them next to each other. So whereas this one says, I am tired because I went to sleep late, this would just say, I am tired, semicolon, I went to sleep late. It could be a semicolon, it could be a period. It just puts the two ideas next to each other and leaves it to the reader to connect the two. And then our last sentence type we'll talk about together is called telegraphic. This one's easy. It's a sentence shorter than 5 words. The purpose of this is just to simplify the syntax of a written work or to dramatize a point. If you have a lot of longer sentences and then all of a sudden there's a shorter one, it kind of catches your attention a little bit more. So sometimes writers use this to emphasize a certain point. And so make sure that these are all in your notes and feel free to email me or ask me about any questions that you have.